Welcome to Climate Courage. My name's Andrea Edwards.
Hi, I'm David Coe.
And at the far end, as usual, you have me, Richard Bussolato.
It's a perfect place for you. Oh,
Indeed.
it's good.
The naughty corner.
No, I think that's on the other side somehow. It's good to have you back. And David, it's good to have you back, especially because have you recovered fully from COVID?
I have. And it's an incredible experience. As in, I had COVID before and it just repeated all the symptoms.
Right. For me, it's all sinus when I get it.
Yeah. Interestingly, I had a conversation with a friend in Kenya at the time. And he was surprised that I was getting COVID because he thought it was all over. And I had a quick look on the map. And in Europe, the numbers are really flaring up.
Yeah.
And it's singular that in Africa, where he was, there were basically no cases.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there's a 25% increase in deaths in the UK because of the new strain of COVID. So,
yeah,
it's going to be with us for the rest of our lives, and it will take directions we can't really fathom. And because
this morning.
Yeah, it's just that you lose respect for things that you're around for long enough, right? But you need to remain vigilant. You need to remain sensible, most of all. It's like one of the worst arguments I overheard actually on the train going up to town last week was like, yeah, I tested positive yesterday, but I don't feel bad really. And we just need to get on with it. So you're going to expose all these people on the train and you don't even have the decency of wearing a mask.
Yeah, wow.
It's just mind-boggling.
It's good to be in Asia, I can assure you of that much when it comes to stuff like that.
Yeah.
So today we're going to be talking about getting our cities climate ready. And to do that, I'm bringing a friend of mine. We've been friends for 20 years. His name's John Maynard, and he used to work on I think it was, he can correct me if I'm wrong, the South Sydney Council. And he's one of the people that's an expert in his field. And I love listening to experts who they talk about things that you just never even think about, and they take you on a journey. So I've, in many, many scenarios, listened to what John had to say. And here he is. Oh, wait a minute. It's not. Oh, there you are. Here he is. John,
Hello.
Welcome.
Thanks, Andrea. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Really
Hi,
good
John.
to have you here.
Hi, welcome.
Thank
So
you.
just to give everyone a sense of what you've done as far as your career goes, do you want to just give us a quick overview?
Yeah, well, a bit of a mixed and varied background. My background in tertiary education is in psychology and public health. And for most of my career, I've spent in local government in a field called crime prevention and community safety. So there's basically two dimensions to that way of making and shaping urban environments, if you will. You look at sort of the physical environment, the built environment. And as Winston Churchill once said, we make our buildings and the buildings shape us. But I'm also interested in the social dimension and how we as humans interact with the built environment. So there's this sort of mix between criminology, between sociology and environmental psychology, and how the environment that we're in makes us think, feel and behave. That has all sorts of dimensions in terms of crime and safety, but more broadly also when we're looking at public health, broader issues around social justice, livability and sustainability.
Comprehensive.
Yeah.
Yes. That's why it's taking this book I'm writing so long.
Oh wow! I'd love to hear more about the book. So definitely we'll get that opportunity. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Indeed.
And
what now?
Yeah.
Well, the book started out as looking at how we plan and design a safe city. And once I started sort of exploring deeper and deeper into that world of crime and safety, it became fairly evident early on that you could design a safe city where you had an oppressive government, where you had closed circuit television everywhere, where you had barbed wire everywhere, where people avoided their neighbours and put iron bars and barbs and sort of all sorts of fortresses around their living environments. And, that potentially can be a safe city in what might be a repressed government's perspective. So then I started, because I came from a background more in community development as well as psychology and public health, it got me sort of thinking that I have to approach this subject matter on a much broader level and look at these dimensions of livability. What are the public health dimensions to a safe city? What makes for a healthy place? What makes for a healthy social environment where we trust one another, where we actively get to know and look out for each other? It's often said that community safety is like charity and that it begins at home. So the importance of those sorts of neighbourhood connections, those intangibles that we can take for granted on so many levels, but certainly when we face adversity, we rely very much on the people that we live amongst. And neighbours are very much like family. You don't get to choose who they are. We end up with kind of random selection of people all living together. So we've got to kind of work that out at that micro level. But more broadly, when we're looking at the city overall, we've got to also look at how we look after one another's health, as I mentioned. We need institutions which are strong criminal justice system, the courts, the police, the corrective services systems. But we also have to look at how we look after those early intervention years, but in particular, children aged 0 to 5, early support to young parents, social crime prevention, which looks at anything from community events to youth services to services for older people, services which really recognise difference, which promote broad-mindedness and tolerance for different kinds of people in different kind of places, because that's what the social fabric of a city is essentially all about. And then we combine them with the more specific area of focus of my particular portfolio, which is the planning and design sector, and how the association between architecture and criminal activity, and how we sort of plan and design around preventing crime and getting somebody with the wrong intentions to think twice about what they plan to do, based on ways that we can prevent that offence from occurring through the planning and design process.
So how far off the book?
So the book, I've just been writing the last chapter today, or writing the second draft of the last chapter, which is all about walking and pedestrian activity and how important that is to a safe and well-functioning, livable city. Fundamentally, the quality of the footpath in many ways determines the relationships that we share with the people we live amongst and the people that we work with and so forth. Looking at that dimension of pedestrianisation, not only from, as I said, the microenvironment of the footpath, but also the built-in, how the footpath shapes the built environment, how that shapes how we get around cities, how we're mobile in cities, which is also really important to our prosperity and to our economic and social political development. And there's also all sorts of sort of angles to walking in a city, and climate change is something that really impacts on pedestrianisation through landscaping, through porous surfaces and healthy environments, all sorts of parks and reserves, and all sorts of ways that livability contributes to walkability, if you like. So that's sort of the last bit I've been working on. So, I can see a light at the end of the tunnel, and it's taken a long time for that light to appear because, as I said, the task has been a monumental one, but certainly very proud and relieved that I'm approaching the finishing line, if so, on my hands and knees.
Congratulations.
Yeah,
Thank you.
we've all published books, so we understand. How many words? What's your final output?
I haven't counted the words other than to say it's developed into quite a big tome.
Yes. Yeah, well, it sounds like it needs to be. All right. So we always start the show off with some recent news that's been getting attention before we go into the main theme. And obviously, there's a lot of news this week and last week around the AMOC collapse. We've got COP16, the biodiversity conference going on. The news isn't looking good on that front either. But David, you were mentioning before we started some breaking news. Would you like to start with that one?
Absolutely. The discovery. I'm not sure if discovery is the right term, but anyway, I'll go with it for now. That's the migrant boats. The boats that have been carrying these migrants over from certainly into the UK, but around and so on, has been coming from Germany. And this is a bit of a shock because in some ways the image of Germany is this place where, people are very well behaved and things are very, kind of straight down the line, and you wouldn't imagine them doing something like this. And people had always thought it was the French, and then kind of people associated with it in that way. And in some ways it really shakes your confidence about how our governance is actually working and how the whole migrant situation is turning into industrialized opportunities for some people.
So are the Germans that are doing this from the government, or are they a criminal organization?
I'd call it private enterprise.
Okay. Interesting.
I think that's the part of it which makes it, we want to call it criminal organizations, but at some point they filter back into, if it's a boat, rubber dinghies and things. You go down there and people buy rubber dinghies for all sorts of reasons.
Mm.
And people are not asking, why are you buying 6?
Yeah, right.
Why are you storing them there in that way? So I think it's easy to try to say it's a criminal organization and push that responsibility away, push that. It effectively becomes a rationalization to say, there are worse people out there, I'm not part of those. And so you don't have to accept the responsibility that the people passing through, the people in our city. Going back to what John was saying, this is sort of a little bit of the image. I had a friend who lived in Mexico who says, they live in zones. There are safe zones and there are unsafe zones. If you're in the safe zones, you don't have to feel responsible about what happens over the elements.
Right, yeah.
And in other cities, they are more mixed together. And in that way, it becomes much more of a shared responsibility.
Yeah, I think that'll definitely be part of the conversation. One of the pieces I shared with both of you was called The Big Climate Short by Bloomberg. And I think this can also lead into the US election conversation. But Richard, what are your thoughts on that one? Because it really focused on the hedge fund. What is it? Hedge fund managers?
Yeah, and as a former one, without the horns growing, they are, I would generally describe as the smartest people in the financial universe. They are extremely disciplined and they're very, very hardworking. They have a collective bet, and that is obviously made up of a myriad of managers at a myriad of funds all over the world, where you have effectively decided that you want to be long the fossil fuel industry in its shapes and forms, and you want to be short the renewable energy because you think that's overpriced by fossil fuels are cheap. And the article obviously tries to create this tension that they are effectively anti-progress and anti-renewable rollout. But again, somewhat in defense of the industry, is actually an entirely rational bet. And it's probably a bet that needs to be done by someone to highlight the fallacy of current energy policies around the world. Fossil fuels look pretty cheap. I actually think they look very cheap, and they're necessary. We're going to use them for quite some time to come. Vilifying them, and like a lot of managers has been forced to do, particularly when they have certain mandate, is opting out of owning them in your portfolio is basically not the viable path. Because the moment you sell off your holdings of these companies, you have no influence over what they do anymore. And intrinsically, on a basic cash flow analysis, they look fairly cheap. while the renewable energy providers are still not profitable or barely profitable. And ultimately, they are relying on government subsidies and various forms of regulation to protect them in an environment where actually they should be able to roll out freely because they are a cheaper alternative. And in a planetary sense, they are a cheaper alternative because we are not treating the fossil fuels with the true cost that they carry. And that highlights the problem. You might have all the great intentions of rolling out enormous renewable programs to actually take us away from the fuel. But as long as that fuel remains available, you should probably actually own it, not discard it, because then you have control over what happens to the fossil fuels. And oil, gas, and coal will continue to be produced as long as you are not getting paid for not doing so. It's really simple. And I think the hedge fund industry highlights that position. And it's been extremely profitable for them over the last couple of years. Fossil fuel companies have done well because they're intrinsically cheap. And a lot of people don't own them anymore. So there's not that many guys left to sell those companies.
Well, I think there's definitely a political story in here, right? So you've got Trump with drill baby drill going on in that way, and you have him essentially very strongly advocating that, and that's one part of it. And I think the other side of this is that the renewable industry has become very politicized.
Yes.
So it's not actually an economic investment. I think what Richard is saying is that, and if you look at how the wind turbine manufacturers have been over 2022, 23, and even this year, they've been loss making, and it's because they can't cope with rising costs. But that's a symptom of the way the whole economy is. This economy works by a value proposition of making money. As long as you can keep making money, you can have better lives, and all those things comes along. So the whole proposition throughout it is making money. But making money has itself a nemesis, and that's your cost of living. Because when your cost of living start rising, the making money starts making less sense. And when the cost of living crosses over to the making money, you're now kind of working all the hour God's gift, and you still can't make ends meet. And that's what's been happening to a lot of these, wind turbine manufacturers and people like that. And the politicizing has actually hyped that because it's made everybody go for the same resources and the same way of doing it. There are hundreds of ways of actually creating wind energy. But there is only one approach that is being approached at by the world. As a result of this, the resources that are used are all concentrated into the same thing. And so the prices go up and keep going up. And as an industry, you can't actually make it work if all you see is greater competition for the same resources. You've got to step away and do something else.
Right. So, but there's another subtlety in that article that I think they could have made a hell of a lot more out of, and that was obviously China's so far ahead in the renewable space, which takes away the opportunity for investment. So, that to me, that's a whole big other side of the story.
That's an idiocy. That's complete idiocy from the part of the EU and the Americans. If you want the world to go electric, then China can give you an electric car for under $10,000. They can probably make one for you for under $1,000. They can certainly make wind, solar panels, and all those things cheap as dirt. But the EU and the US is forcing them to say they have to be sold at very expensive prices. That's the same with wind turbines and everything else. The reality is China itself has a massive capacity internally for what it uses. And it has a massive access into developing Asia and other places. So this is very much a story of selling the dominant Western countries, which are focused on a Western market, to say, actually, governments can't keep subsidizing it. They're going to run out of money. And these businesses can't run in an environment where government's forcing the prices to be uneconomical, refusing to allow competitors in because people will find a way around it. People will always find a way through. So So that's kind of where the hedge funds come in that way.
All right, and then the final news, obviously, the US election. God, I can't wait till it's over. It's so stressful. It really is. I'm seeing a lot of stuff going on, sort of behind the scenes, sort of stuff. I wanted to get a sense of, John. Do you want to start? What are you feeling about what's going on? Who do you see is coming out the other end?
Well, it certainly feels like the longest campaign in the world ever. They really do start early on these things over there. I suppose my personal view is that there's a certain irony in a country being referred to as the United States having perhaps the most divided country anywhere, if the polls are accurate in any way. I saw somebody interviewed this morning. My daughter was showing me a YouTube clip where a reporter was interviewing people at the pre-poll around why they were voting for a certain candidate. And one of the Trump voters was asked if you had a choice between Harris or Putin, who would you vote for? And the person replied with, I'd vote, if you hypothetically you had that choice. They said, I'd always vote for Putin because he's a man of the people, was the response, which was, a very interesting, obviously, reaction to what was going on. I always wonder, the other thing I also sort of observe in the election is when people are asked why they vote for a certain person or candidate, they often reply because that candidate represents greater freedom to them than somebody else. So notions of freedom seem to be used differently, certainly over in the United States to elsewhere. Certainly in Australia, we don't talk about freedom in that sense. And certainly there's people who live in this country, certainly Indigenous people certainly Australia with its checkered colonial history would certainly have a view on what that exactly means as well, the notions of freedom. But over there it seems to be this idea that you promote individualism at the root of what the United States is all about, and why shouldn't I do this, why can't I do that? And they seem to prefer, generally speaking, the candidate who can say all the right things to that individual, rather than if you're able to ask that person what policies that person stands for, that they respect, or the reason for why they might vote for that person. That doesn't seem to be part of the criteria. So it seems to me it's very personality based to begin with, but it's also very individualistic.
Yeah, it feels like the falling days of Rome. It's the orators rather than the people that actually. Yeah, David, do you want to go?
I look at something like 538, which is which started probably, I can't remember when. It might have been before first Trump, or even before. But anyway, they do these modeling that's pretty real time as it goes along. And they have these, they give out these simulations of distributions. If there were 100 elections of different, happened along, what's the draw? What does it look like? And you can then sort of have a look at that distribution and then see what's going on. And what it says to me is, as you look around the center, which is where the close elections are, it leans towards Trump. And if you go a little bit further away from the center, it leans even more towards Trump, which means that basically if it's a close election, Trump is likely to come and win, more likely to win it according to these kind of simulations and polls. But if you go further away, then you have this huge tails for Democrats. So there are these people all around who kind of feel, really strongly Democrats in that way. And the only way you can get those sort of scenarios if all the swing states flip over and things of that kind. It's not impossible to do. And it comes down in many ways down to that ultimate turnout, really, in many respects, right? And you have all the pre-votes and all the rest of it. And because of that, what is almost certain to happen is that you're not going to know what happens for a while, because there's no way that this election will not be contested. Whether it is a close election or whether it's a landslide outcome, there's no way that it will not be dragged through the courts. which then opens this question, as John was describing: should an election really be decided by the courts in this way?
Especially these courts, right?
Signing up for. I mean, you know, in some other countries, it would be like, let's just do it again, or something. And obviously, you know, you can end up in these situations of you know, how many times and so on. And there is definitely an issue that the forms of election no longer feel like they're serving the people. That's why there's all this tension. There's this sense, there's a lot of the intangibles. I think, as John was describing, you know, how do people feel safe in the city? How do people feel safe in an election? That they actually have a part. How do they have that visibility? It's like it's full of dark alleys instead of having nice green open squares.
Yeah. Richard?
Yeah, I think John's analysis was very, very good. And David is pointing out, I think, very much what markets are sensing. And if you look at the price action over the last 2 weeks in financial markets, it's definitely tilting heavily towards a Trump win. And the sort of iconic, very famous hedge fund manager, again, was on the wires, and he was being asked effectively, should we trust the polls? Which polls are trustworthy, and how much does the election matter? And I'm probably with him in the camp that I actually don't think the election matters that much compared to how central it seems to be in news. In factual outcome, I don't see parts that will make the two candidates all that different, because they're still being held prison by Congress and events way beyond their control. But secondly, he said, look at what the markets are doing. They're better than any polling. And in his mind, Trump is probably edging back the territory he lost in the late summer when he was catastrophic on television. And that I sense, and I haven't followed it closely, I might add, but I think Harris's appearances lately have been pretty close to catastrophic. And that is probably what's tilting it back. From an election you felt in August, she had probably almost already won. But you cannot be that bad in your appearance and expect to get away with it. And the people surrounding her have made catastrophic errors of judgment in terms of how to pitch her, portray her, and what questions should be asked, because she has been awful in her appearance. And I think that's been reflected in the polls. Then again, what David touches upon is that the US election is basically like no other. It's not proportional. It's not first past the post for each seat. It's a very complicated for most people to understand how the votes are actually gathered and how meaningless voting is in 80% of the country, because those states have already been decided. So I expect, without being a statistician, it's probably pretty hard to model the outcome compared to most other elections when you can use fewer variables. And then you also come down to the fact that people being asked in polls are not necessarily always honest. And I think that might go more so for this kind of election than others. So the 7 states that are effectively going to decide the election, they're all extremely close. But what seems to be statistically certain is that they're all drifting towards Trump at various pace. And whether Harris can hold on to the advantage in some of them, or whether she would give it up, that's going to decide the election. And then it will be contested.
Yeah, it's interesting that you think she's had a poor showing. I think she's had a positive showing. I haven't really liked the switch to the sort of more antagonistic approach, but at the same time, you know, when they go high, when they go low, we go high. I think it's time to go for the jugular. So I think the left world has been too nice for too long. It's time to get a bit aggressive. So I'm watching the news, I'm watching the conversation, I'm watching both sides, and it's really two different stories when you read, when you follow the right and you follow the left, completely different stories. Same piece of news. You know, when she did the Fox interview, if you looked at the right wing, it was a disaster. If you looked at the left, it was a huge success. So it's a really interesting. But some of the polls and articles that I'm interested in, one is how much women over 50 are being underestimated, massively underestimated. when Donald Trump won in 2016, I was gutted because it meant that women voted for him. 38% of the voting out of the US is women. They win elections, right? They're the most important demographic. So I was really gutted about that, especially because of what he'd been saying about women and how disrespectful. So they're saying that's very much underestimated, and obviously abortion and women's rights are a big issue, and they're going to come out in huge numbers, and they tend to vote in high numbers. The other one is in 2016, he had 33 points for non-educated whites. By 2020, when he lost the election, he had 31 advantage, and now he's at 29. So he's losing his primary base, right? And I'm watching a lot of the conversations. There's a lot of new polls that have been introduced that are GOP polls, and they're showing a lot of information in the world about the 50-50 split. I think she's going to get between 310 and 312. That's my verdict. So you can't argue with it, right? It's just what I think. But I do think she's going to come out with a landslide. And there's 4 years of voters who've never been polled because they've never voted. So they poll people who've already voted, and they're young people. And we don't know how they're going to vote yet because no one's really polling them in that official sense, because that's not how they do it. So I'm very confident. And I think, so the Wall Street Journal just published an article this week, something like 80-something% of Americans are feeling really despondent. Did you see that?
Yep.
And when it comes down to it, what they're despondent about is the division. And when you listen to what she did, like the CNN town hall yesterday, it's about consensus building. It's about coming together. She's working with the Never Trump Republicans. She was on the campaign trail with Liz Cheney. So she's got Republicans on stage with her. So I think she addresses that concern, whereas, Donald Trump doesn't. And I think her great recent line is, he's got an enemies list, I've got a to-do list. So that's starting to get a bit of pickup. So that's where I think. And we have to remember, Donald Trump sent the climate movement back by a decade the last time he was in power. So he's a huge threat, not just to the US, but to the world. And that's why I pay so much attention to the US election. But I'm positive that it's going to be a Democrat win. And it's not because I'm a Democrat or a Republican. It's got nothing to do with that. I don't sit in any camp. But I believe that we need to build a world of consensus and cooperation. And if we don't, well, we'll be saying goodbye on climate courage at some point soon, because there's no point.
I don't think you should have to say goodbye to courage, but I think that that's going to bring it sort of to John in many ways, because I think there is this aspect where people are putting all their bets on the governments. I'd love to put an air quote around it in the sense of, governments per se, as being the one to make it work along. But they're not going to. And I want to sort of take it back in the sense of a cities and what John talks about. What are the things that makes a city safe? Is it actually the government, or is it something more intangible than that? Is it that if you have mentioned, if you've got CCTV cameras everywhere, is that what makes people feel they can really belong in a city and safe, or is there something much more than that?
Well, that's a big question. And after the world politics sort of story, but just on the politics, I'd sort of begin by saying I think there's a general malaise again around politics and Western democracies generally. I think certainly in the research in the US election tells us that people made up their minds well before the campaign began. So they don't. The research suggests that the campaigns themselves don't necessarily swing people one way or another. There's a recent research out, news item this week around Keir Starmer's first 100 days in office in the UK. And the media love to roll out the old 100-day story for these poor old governments who've been elected for 5 minutes and are expected to have some sort of list of achievements within that time. So it's a very difficult time, I think, to be in government more generally, and certainly we're seeing it in Australia, where we're sort of running up to our federal election, which will be held next year, which seems to, a 3-year cycle in government seems to happen in the twinkling of an eye. So it's all that whole machine starting to rumble along in the media here as well. But I think there is a general sort of malaise around world politics generally, and as you say, David, there's this notion around, government, people's expectations of government perhaps aren't as realistic as they should be, particularly, when cost of living pressures are high and, we have existential threats of climate change and so forth. For young people, they have issues around housing affordability, permanent employment and so forth. So the generations coming through, the ones you alluded to, Andrea, who haven't voted yet, for example, it can look like a big bad world out there. And I think that sort of level of cynicism and fear, if you like, amongst generations coming through is definitely something we should be very, very concerned about, particularly where we don't have a good record of generally involving young people in public policy as a rule. But just to go back to David's question about cities generally, certainly in America, we know that the Democratic vote is very much established in cities. And so those people who wish the Democratic Party well will look to the cities to carry Harris over the line in that sense. But cities, governments certainly do play and strong institutions certainly underpin what makes for a safe and coherent and prosperous and flourishing city. There's no doubt about that. And systems of law and order and good systems of governance, more than anything else, underpin what makes for a safe and well-functioning urban environment. Of course, it's very, very complex, and some people have even said that cities are human beings' greatest achievements in many ways, despite the many complexities that surround them. But we know that people continue to come to cities in greater numbers, looking for more opportunity, looking for a greater quality of life. And we've got 8 billion people on our planet at the moment, a bit more than that. And most of those people are going to live in cities and will continue to come to cities. I think they're looking at 2 in 3 people will live in cities by 2030. So that's going to place a lot of pressure on these urban environments to get their systems of governance right, particularly in terms of safety and security and broader sort of quality of life as well. So systems of government are important, but also, we need to take that personal responsibility, that shared responsibility that you also alluded to, David, that notion that we all are responsible for ultimately looking out for ourselves and each other. That's a fundamental principle of human nature. And once we move away from that sort of notion and rely perhaps too much on government or other people to please us, then we can go down these very divisive and very destructive roads. So
John, one of the things that really sort of I'm going to just mute you when I talk because there's a sound in the background. One of the things that I feel that's been happening for the last 40, 50 years as wealth has grown. So, we've got half the planet's population is now considered middle class, right? And what I've seen is there's a lot of people sitting on their ass being armchair critics. But what you're saying is, that real getting involved in politics, being civic assemblies, all that sort of stuff. But rather than just saying, sitting there pointing the finger, we all have to come together. And the other thing I think that governments need to really do is, when you look at the inflation issue and a lot of the issues in the US economy and other economies, obviously around the world, it's climate related impacts that are creating the problems. And the leaders of our countries aren't talking about it. So there's not an honest dialogue going both ways. There's no trust, which is a massive issue. So I think it's such a critical point that we've got to get right.
Yeah, exactly. Not only trust in government, but I think trust in each other and start looking at the world in a much more of a collective sense. And it's very hard. I think people do look to themselves to look in the mirror at ways that they can make themselves better. And again, you turn to young people, suddenly people talk about their short attention spans, and I've been writing about wayfinding and getting lost in cities, for example, and it was a way that when older people move through cities, we pick up landmarks and we move about on foot, and we form these mental maps. And when we come back from where we've been, we point out those landmarks are within our brains, and we find our way back to where we've come from. Young people use their phones to get from A to B. They're told to turn second left here, second right there, first left there, and get to their destination. And woe and behold, when they need to get back to where they've come from, they use the phone again to direct them exactly the same way. So they become very much reliant on the technology in that sense. And, that's sort of a clear example of a distinct difference in the generations and how we operate. And certainly this sort of reliance on the phone, I think, has been quite a distraction, I think, for that notions of trust, if you like, that they're more inclined to get online and be attached to their device, get their information online and so forth. And, getting these younger people out of their funk, if you like, and getting them to actually be part of public policy, involving them in what we as adults plan to do, would be a good starting point, because they're the ones who are going to lead us into the future, and they're the ones who need to be driving what we need to do to make our planet a better place. And I think their views and their concerns and their efforts are dangerously overlooked.
Yeah.
There's an episode of Doctor Who. I don't know if you follow Doctor Who. Is recent series, and Doctor Who is basically this UK program that started back in 60s or thereabout, about a human-like alien who goes around and he's the Doctor, and the idea that he goes around and he helps people along, and he never kills anyone. He always finds a solution that doesn't require that, no matter how antagonistic or whatever the situation. But in this recent episode, they had this projection into the future world of humans in that way, because he travels through time, and they have these bubbles around them, and they go along. I got to get to work, and they would say, "You go to work now." It says, go forward, turn right, open the door, go left, and then of course one day it all broke down, and they are stuck there. They can't move. They don't know how to navigate around their own environment. And what you described just really kind of brought that back to me.
Yes.
In that way. And this way of navigating around the environment is more than the physical environment, because we don't go out on the streets. We don't know how to navigate around people in that way. There was an Ig Nobel Prize. I don't know if you heard of the Ig Nobel Prize.
Yes, of course.
It's kind of like the alternative of the Nobel Prize, and its intention is about highlighting research that makes you laugh and that makes you think. And a couple of years ago, there were 2 papers that were awarded this prize, and the first one was, why do people not run into each other on the streets, keep hitting each other? And the second was, why do people keep hitting each other on the streets? And for me, what that brought out is this aspect of how do we navigate around each other. And it's physical, but then there is also the human connections, and the elections bringing up this aspect. In the US, we now don't really navigate ourselves around each other. We need them to agree with us first before we can walk on the same street.
All right. Can I just suggest we just keep it moving? I'm looking at the time. So getting our cities climate ready, right? All right, John, what do we need to do? And what are you already seeing happening around the world?
Oh, look, I think we're seeing a lot of good things done. So I don't think the situation's all doom and gloom. I think, cities are, I think, by their nature, centres of innovation, and most cities now operate are fundamentally based on the knowledge economy. So we have smarter and smarter people doing smarter and smarter things, which is not to say we don't make the same mistakes over and over again, or that we ignore the things that we could do better, because that's also true. But there's things that we're doing, again, these things start at home. What can we do in our own homes about this kind of issue? And then how does that look when we take that sort of priority into our own local communities? Which, as I said earlier, get to know the people that you live amongst, for example. Say hello when you walk down the street. We don't just we always look at one another when we walk down the street. It's a very, very quick glance. And we do that so that we don't bump into each other, which that research might have also found out, David, that you alluded to. But we do actually eye each other off all the time in public places, partly, as I said, to avoid bumping into each other, but it's also a little bit of a notion of acknowledging one another, even though it may happen on a subconscious level. So those sorts of, like I said, the things like walking in your local community. So you're going to need a good quality footpath, for example. You don't want holes in the footpath. You don't want obstructions on the footpath. You don't want a neighbourhood which is made up of low-density homes where everybody gets in their car and drives to where they're going, drives into their underground car park, presses the button, goes up the lift into their office, comes back down to the lift, gets into their car, drives home, probably gets stuck in traffic, lets off a lot of noise and air pollution, drives back with the remote control into their garage, and enter their home. So you can actually make those sorts of journeys without interacting with anybody. Whereas, a 5-metre walk along the footpath outside your home, you might actually walk past a couple of people where you do have to acknowledge one another, particularly if there are people who live in your street and you recognise one another. So the quality of the walking environment at that micro level and notions of neighbourliness and having a sense that we need to, as I said, look out for the people we live amongst. We need things like, we need to cool down our cities is another big factor, which means that we need urban canopy strategies in cities. We need to actually look at streets, street by street. We're seeing some studies coming out now where they don't just plant native species because the climate's changing. So they have to, certainly in Australia, we're planting landscaping in Sydney based on landscaping which has applied more traditionally or historically in cities more north of Sydney, where there's a different kind of landscaping to accommodate the fact that these cities are now getting warmer. So we need to actually change the way we think about how we landscape our cities, and that may include different species of different trees on different sides of the road, because different sides of the road will get more sunlight than others, and that then can affect pedestrian movement, because then people may walk in the winter on the sunny side and in the shade in the summer. So they've actually done studies where they observe the way people use spaces. So fundamentally, I think we need to understand the user experience more than anything. When we're thinking about climate change in cities, we need to ask people who understand spaces better than anybody else what those situations are like and how we can make them safer and more comfortable, and just being wary of us as experts sort of parachuting in and telling people what to do, because I think wherever you are, in whatever situation you're in, people understand their spaces better than anybody else. You should never underestimate that when we're looking at solutions to climate change.
So when I think of the so I'm just going to just quickly mute. When I think of the wealthy world, different trees on different sides of the streets, understanding footpaths, just footpaths. I lived in Thailand for 7 years, and one of the things I've enjoyed about coming back to Singapore is I can walk on a footpath. There's a lot of cars and gates interrupting my footpath, so I've got to walk on the street, but it's still safe, right? Apart from all the electric vehicles that have suddenly arrived, so you can't even hear them. But, the shanty towns, millions and millions and millions of people live in shanty towns and tin shacks. without any shade on construction sites. And so, for me, it's like that thought that goes to those people, that those lives of value, that, that they deserve something. So I recently saw construction here. So just today I saw an article in Eco Business talking about Singapore is, by the end of the century, 365 days a year will be heat above livable temperatures, and that's an average of 35. But they're also expecting to see it up to 46, right? So just think about that, 46 degrees in Singapore on the equator with all the humidity. Above 35, that's when rice can't grow. So we don't obviously have rice fields here because it's too small, but the countries above it and below it, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, they're just going to be dead zones because nothing can grow and the people won't be able to survive. So I know you're in Indonesia recently. Have you got any thoughts about what you're seeing in the developing world?
Well, there's no doubt that the effects of climate change are going to affect the developing world far more than Western democracies, who are going to be able to some extent, pay their way out of these problems. The issue with the developing world is often that they're also the very same places that have burgeoning populations as well. So, again, Western democracies have increasingly lower and lower birth rates. Fundamentally, I think the biggest climate change challenge we have on the planet and public health more generally is overpopulation. And certainly climate change will affect countries with these increasing birth rates more than anywhere else. And that most of those countries, in fact, the top 10 countries on the planet with the highest increasing birth rates are all in Africa. So I think the effects of climate change are going to affect that continent more than anywhere else. And it will affect women and children more than anywhere else in those countries as well, because the existing inequities that exist, not just so much in developing countries, but I think worldwide. And I think certainly the gender lens is something we really need to be more and more aware of if we're going to make our way out of the problems that we've in many ways created for ourselves in the developing world. You talk about, people who live in poor quality housing, for example, housing without electricity, housing without power, societies that are essentially very, very unequal, and trying to promote that message to people that we all pay for inequality. Inequality doesn't just affect those who are disadvantaged in some way. Poverty is something that we all pay for, and it's something that again we need to be taught, moving the debate to more towards equality, I think, as much as anything, and equity as well, particularly when we're talking about looking through the gender lens. So we're doing some good things in some good places, I think, but we're also making bad mistakes as well. We're seeing good things, like we're seeing more blue infrastructure going into cities and in the developing world as well. We're seeing more fountains, more use of water to cool things down. Better access to water is, again, a fundamental human right. That's something that I think is improving in many places. We're seeing more street lighting going into places. Street lighting is a really important dimension to quality of life. Where you have dark urban environments, again, women and children are heavily influenced by that. A male will just, without thinking, go for a walk after dark. For a woman, that's a very different dimension. Safety is very much a contextual phenomenon. It depends whether you're a male or a female, whether you're young or you're old, whether it's night or whether it's day, whether you're with other people, whether you're alone, whether you're mobile, whether you have a disability. There's all sorts of dimensions to what makes for a safe place. And it's very much an individual thing, and it's very much situational based. A place that can be safe one moment can be unsafe the next. So street lighting is something that developing countries are seeing more and more of. And interestingly, on that front, as street lighting has evolved and become cheaper and more efficient, in the interests of equity, we then try and roll it out to more and more places. But that effect, as now some of the research is coming out to say that the rebound effect has actually been reached in terms of the quality of the night sky, the quality of light pollution and sky glow, which is now predominant in space. There was some a recent study done at Van Gogh's famous painting of the Starry Night, painted in a small village in Provence in the late 19th century. Of course, the development of street lighting back in the day suddenly gave artists, the opportunity to go out and actually paint these scenes, which up until then it was just too dark to do so. But of course, if you go to that same village today, because it's within 100 kilometres of 3 cities, Toulon, Marseille, and one other one I can't think of offhand, you can't actually see that night sky anymore because of the light pollution that now is all over Western Europe. So, yeah, Europe's done okay out of that kind of advances in LED lighting. But developing countries, of course, in the interests of equity, want those things too. But for the planet as a whole, it's not a great thing. And in terms of something that we do badly, street lighting is a good example of that, because it's often many local municipalities' biggest expenses. And where you have the effects of climate change, where your bridges are being washed away and the quality of your footpaths are poor, all sorts of infrastructure issues that municipalities have trouble maintaining, often because the politics are such that higher levels of government like to give grant money to new things, but not to maintain old things. So when street lighting goes in, the street in my street, for example, the lights will be on from 8 o'clock tonight until 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, including between, say, midnight and 4 a.m. when perhaps no pedestrian or no car will go down the street, and yet we will continue to burn the fossil fuels to illuminate my street all night long. And that happens in cities everywhere across the world. So I think street lighting is a good example of something we can, which we all pay for, which we can do a lot better at, but it's certainly something that's providing great benefits to developing countries.
Yeah, right. That's so interesting. One of the things that like building the right homes for the future, right? So in the UK, if the UK built all the homes it had to build to house everyone it needs to house, it basically would use up its entire emissions in a year just from that, right? And then you look at Sydney, where they've got these areas like Parramatta, which is a massive area outside of the city, and they've built these enormous housing estates that have all got these black roofs. There's no trees because they're all new. They're basically the houses are up to the fences both on every side. And when the heat extreme prediction for last summer, they were very concerned about people surviving in those homes during that potential heat. The heat didn't happen. It actually was cooler in Australia than it was in the rest of the world. But this year they're again predicting a heat, even though it's a La Nina year. But how many of those sort of scenarios have we got in a place like Australia?
A lot, unfortunately, a lot. I mean, Australia's part of the New World, and Australian cities, like many American cities, are represented by vast, sprawling housing landscapes. So we have limited density in the core of our cities, and you don't have to get far out from those cores, 5 to 8 kilometres or so, and you're in these quarter-acre block rolling suburb after suburb of low-density development, which, as you say, Andrea, goes on and on and on in cities that don't have clear geographical boundaries. So a lot of cities are constrained by the geography, by the sea, by the river, by the mountains, and so forth. Sydney my city has those natural boundaries within them, but it's a very big geographical area in comparison to other cities. So one of the problems we make in terms of land use mix and the use of land is that we continue to develop what's referred to as greenfield development, where you're taking the old farmer's agricultural farm and you're saying we're going to turn this into a new housing estate. The developer wants to put as big a house as possible on that parcel of land that they're entitled to. So they'll build a 4-bedroom house because that will maximise their return by having a bigger house on a smaller block of land. That block of land will, because it's further and further away from the sea, a city like Sydney, which is getting increasingly hotter, like many cities, it's very, very hot out there. You've got to drive your car. There's limited landscaping available, limited green spaces, parks and reserves, regional parks and so forth. Black roofs, as you say, very little renewable energy going in. Governments have to build streets and provide infrastructure and sewerage and drainage, street lighting and roads and maintain those things. There's all sorts of costs in the infrastructure to government to run these greenfield sites, when we should, like cities everywhere, be going up rather than out. So we need to get people out of their cars. We need to increase density. We need to get people using public transport. We need active transport. We need separated cycling routes. And we need good quality footpaths so that people can walk to the places that they need to get to, whether that's work or school or the supermarket or the bar or the cafe, the restaurant, whatever it is. So development and land use is a real issue in Australia as far as climate change goes, and urban development more generally.
And paint those roofs white, right?
Yeah, amongst other things. But really what they should be doing is protecting those areas of land, and as I said, focusing more on what's referred to in the literature as the missing middle, and actually making it allowable that your home on the quarter-acre block is now going to be rezoned into an area which will now accommodate medium to high density development, people living in apartments. That's what young people want to live in. It's a foreign concept to many of us who grew up in suburban houses like myself, but certainly young people in cities predominantly now are wanting to live in apartments. It's something that's been happening in the Middle East and Europe, of course, for centuries, but it's coming quickly to the New World in places like America and Australia, and in many ways it can't come soon enough. It's what central governments want to do, but for local governments elected on a local platform where development is never seen as a sexy thing to get votes, you end up with these tensions between central government and local government. Central government wanting to increase density, increase the use of public transport and so forth, against local government representatives who are elected to represent the interests of local communities, who generally by their nature are often anti-development.
It's a classic dilemma. What you're describing is obviously, it's a little bit alien to me. I grew up in Sweden. Sweden shares some characteristics with the US and Australia. It's a pretty vast country. Alas, I did not grow up in the countryside. I grew up straight in middle of Stockholm. And I think when you have relatively young nations like the US and Australia and vast amount of land, that whole concept is alien to people. Outside of Manhattan, which is relatively constrained, most US cities can just keep on growing. And there still are. In Australia, I would imagine very much it's the same. Yes, Sydney is somewhat confined, but the other big cities, Perth could probably keep on growing as far as you want, because there's nothing there in an economic sense. You can just keep on rolling it out.
Including water.
That is somewhat different for the old world, if we want to call it that, where you have these major cities in very strategic points, because it made sense 1,000, 2,000 years ago to build the first castle or whatever there, where you cannot keep rolling it out. And everything you're saying makes perfect sense to me, but I can see how it's a different debate in very high density places like Holland, where our daughter lives, and other parts of Central Europe, which is incredibly built and where they're thinking somewhat differently about these things. There it's all about how much green you can preserve while still effectively accommodating very high density populations. And UK is probably quite similar to that. Because you are relatively constrained in a lot of cities in the UK. You cannot really keep going because there's nowhere to go to. You run into the next city.
What do you think about, I have this sort of idea along, that the sort of multi-use developments that are going on. So you have a large area, maybe like a 50-acre site, and you have various buildings which are all interconnected together with kind of pathways and so on, and it's all air conditioned within it. And you have houses, you have kind of light industry, you have entertainment, and you have offices and all of those things, and obviously retail kind of all along with it. And I kind of see that as really, as Andrea says, it gets hotter, places like Singapore, places like Indonesia and so on. These are the kind of developments that naturally lend themselves in that way very much. So effectively, you have a internalized climate completely. You never breathe the air outside, because your pathway from one building to the another is air conditioned. You protect from all of that and all of those things. How I see that happening, but what does that imply if that happens to the kind of crime and sort of situations that you think of?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, David. I think if you want to reduce and prevent crime, you have to get people out and about in public places. And the more people you can get out in public places, generally that safety in numbers effect, or that natural surveillance effect, as we refer to it in crime prevention circles, is something that makes most of us feel safe. But yeah, that phenomenon you're speaking about has also been something that the research talks about in Canadian cities as well, where because they've have very, very harsh winters, you can sort of wander around underground in many different places. And writing the book about walking in many cities in Canada, people go for a walk people try and get their steps up, if you like, and exercise by going underground and walking in the mall walking. And there's actually walking groups that are formed to go mall walking. I don't know if they also exist in a place like Sweden, Richard, quite possibly.
Indeed it does.
Yeah, right. The Swedes were very good at developing public transport at the same time as people wanted the motor car. So I think that's sort of the point of difference between one of the other big points of difference between the new and the old world, if you like, is that when the advent of the motor vehicle, which arguably more than anything changed the nature of cities. The Europeans were smart enough to understand that they needed to develop public transit systems alongside the motorways and improvements they made for motor vehicle access at the same time. So they kept people moving that way as well, and I see that notions of mobility. To your question about air-conditioned and artificial environments, it's something that can disconnect us. It's something I think we should be concerned about. I mean, fundamentally, we also know that breathing natural air is good for us. If you want to breathe healthy environments, you want to get people out into the fresh air, but you need to make those places in their own right desirable. If it's 40 degrees outside, you can very much understand why people don't want to come out and say, particularly older people, more frail people, people with small children, people with mobility issues. It's not always easy for everybody to get out in public places to begin with, let alone if it's very, very hot outside. And certainly the effects of heat are often felt by people months after the event. There was a famous study done in Chicago where about 6 months after a heat wave occurred, they had multiple deaths amongst elderly populations in a part of the city, which they then could trace back to the heat wave 6 months earlier, because the effects of those sorts of extreme climate events are such that the effect on the human body is a very gradual one. And it takes a bit of time to actually ascertain the fact that these things damage people over time rather than straight away. But to your question, fundamentally, we have to get people out even if it's still hot. So you need to provide things like water fountains. You have to provide places where people can splash. Jets of air are coming up out of the pavement. This is becoming more and more common. You've got to provide benches where people can sit, because one of the ways that we can make, safer and better places is encouraging people to linger in these spaces. A well-designed space is where people go to and end up staying longer than they expected to go. That's what a good public space is.
Yeah.
And certainly when I do my corporate training to urban designers and architects and so forth, public space designers, placemakers, these types of people who work in these spaces are saying the indicators of what makes for a good space are actually very much the gestures that people will uphold in those spaces. They'll take their shoes off and dip their feet in the fountain. People being bare feet in a public place is a really good indicator of a well-designed space. People treating public spaces like their lounge rooms, or referred to in the literature as the third room, where people will take off their shirt or recline on a bench, or you'll have furniture which might be movable and people can move it to suit the needs so that they can socialise with one another by moving the furniture. As I said earlier, landscaping strategy, softening the look of the concrete and the glass and the steel that characterises a lot of cities and which generates so much heat. So we've got to get people fundamentally out of those air-conditioned environments at some point, and that will come down, I think, to the quality of the public domain, which, as I said earlier, is informed as much by people who use the space as by the professionals who actually will implement the actual design.
That's so interesting. Just a minute. I'm just going to... Right. So you were talking about the deaths after heat 6 months later. So one of the things that I don't think people are aware of, right? So a lot of the migrant workers from Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India that go and work, especially in the Middle East, they come back and they've been in the heat, such extreme heat for so long that they've got kidney damage. So the organ damage from extreme heat is a really big issue, which I'm sure that's what you're referencing. But what I actually see is in the future, what we're going to have to get prepared for is kidney dialysis units at scale. We're going to have cooling centers at scale. And when I look at during the pandemic, we understood how many beds per population existed in hospitals across the world. And one of the things that really struck me about the numbers, I think the UK had one of the lowest in Europe. Does that sound right? Do you guys know? Do you remember? Germany was one of the highest, and UK was low. Yeah. And I was sitting there and I was thinking, how the hell did we get to the point where the UK has diminished its medical infrastructure and its healthcare infrastructure by so much, when everybody knew that the boomer generation was going to get older in bigger numbers than we'd ever seen before? So why would governments make a decision to shrink something that actually the only thing that, and this goes for housing, it goes for lots of things, but it needed to grow. So where's I think we're all Gen X, right?
Yeah.
From the day I first went to school, I heard how I was going to have to take care of the boomer generation, and there were more than us, right? So we've known all our lives that this big population was going to be coming into play, and as they got older, there would be different needs. How have the governments of the world gotten that so wrong? I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, John, but it's just something that I'm so confused that we're even where we are.
Well, I agree with you. These things are forecast many, many years in advance, and to say you haven't seen these things coming is a complete furphy. But of course, governments are elected in short political cycles, so they don't necessarily look to long-term sustainable goals, and that's of course one of the great challenges of any sort of major crisis of influencing the world, whether it's happening in the here and now in places like the Middle East or the Ukraine, or if it's more existentially in a more gradual thing like we've been talking about climate change. But in terms of cities, it's a really important point because cities are ageing. We are an ageing society, generally speaking, and that has all sorts of implications for how we plan and design our cities. So just alluding to David's point about people in air-conditioned environments, well, that might be fine for a widowed woman because most older people are women. Remember, we need to remember that as well. It's important gender dimension when we're thinking about urban development and when thinking about healthcare provision as well. So it can be very easy for older people, those who are widowed, mostly women, to be isolated in their own homes through the effects of the urban heat island effect, for example, heat waves and so forth. So social isolation is a really big issue, which is going to become bigger and greater and greater as we continue to age. So we need to really consider that, not just in terms of our health system, which, it just seems to me there's a lot of bad news coming out of Britain on so many fronts, not just in terms of the health system, sadly. Broken Britain, as it's sometimes referred to. Why they haven't prepared for that, I don't know. I'm not sure if the effects of not being part of Brexit anymore is a part of that. Perhaps other people on the panel will have an opinion on that. But again, in terms of urban environments, ageing cities is a real problem. We've got to make sure that we connect older people with other older people. We give them things to do. We give them transport. We give them meals, and more than anything else, we connect them with other people and get them out and about, because even life expectancy is in many ways linked to social cohesion. And the more we isolate our older people, and we're all going there. We're all going there ourselves, don't forget.
Steady.
Even for you eventually, Richard. One day well into the future, So, it is a worry that a health system in Britain has gotten to that point now.
I think it's, I think there's this dimension along where, the demographics adds kind of the perspective of the dimension, and then the talk about the governments and so on. For me, governments are not real because politicians only live for so long, and they're only in tenure for so long. So the reason why these things, that's been talked about for such a long time, is because it's an urban development or whatever is necessary, but it's interrupted at every point of the development by a new generation of people who comes in for 3 to 10 years or whatever it is, before before power gets too much in their heads or whatever it is that then requires some transition along. And there's always a more urgent issue than the issue that talks about how do we actually manage to be when we get to 60 or 70, 80 in that way. And that perspective is always going to keep changing. So the part that I really do feel strongly at the moment with regards to climate is that the costs are going to basically mean that we run out of money. It basically means that, I've been thinking about this, I've been talking about this for a while, and I've been saying that our economy is going to collapse. And I realize what I actually mean by that. And that is that you spend all your time, all the time that God gives you to work and make money, and you find that your cost rises above what you can earn. And there will be increasingly fewer people who can manage to stay ahead of that, and increasing many who be caught in it. At that point, the economy doesn't make any sense to anyone to engage in that way. And this whole planning of cities and things, and what I find about you saying about a place to when you take your shoes off, you had a phrase for it.
The third room.
The third room, but there was something else about a pace. For me, what it sounded like, it becomes a pacemaker for people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
If you and that's the thing that you bring out, which really illustrates about the bad side, the disadvantage of the internalized environment, because they are governed by the guards in the shopping malls. You can't sit there comfortably and take your shoes off. And they're too enclosed for anyone to be able to do that. So you constantly lives being moved at a pace, as opposed to being take your shoes off and discover your pace. And your description of a city and what makes a city work is that it is a place where each person can discover their own pace. When you walk down the road and you see the other person there, and you don't bump into them, maybe because you want to go ahead, or maybe you slow yourself down, then you have that choice, and that makes it a safe place for you to be. In a shopping mall, you just never feel that.
Yes.
I think you need to come out to Asia, David. There's shopping malls with ponds that you can put your feet in. I mean, when I raised my boys here when they were small, and I was always looking for something to take them to, and often indoors.
Well, that's the indoor waterfall in Singapore, right?
Well, the Jewel, which is just down the road. But you know, you were talking about, John was talking about, or I think you, David, about living in an air-conditioned environment. I remember the first 10 years here, I was working in big corporate towers and living in basically a permanently air-conditioned environment, and I hated it. Everyone was always sick. People would come to work sick, and these buildings would be circulating this sickness. And I remember there was this thing where everyone was starting to get itchy skin, and there was a lot of talk about it, and it was finally agreed that there was something that was circulating in the air conditioning system that was making people's skin itch, and I don't know what it was called, but living in a permanently air-conditioned environment, I can assure you, as someone who's done it, and I watch, places like Phoenix, those kids have lost their summertime. John, you're talking about the parks. You can't sit on a park bench because it's too hot. You can't take your shoes off because you're going to get third-degree burns on your feet, right? If we continue to allow ourselves to move in that direction, where that's going to be the reality of the whole world, or, that's what I like. Come on, let's wake up. We don't want to go in that direction. And that direction also brings authoritarianism with it, because what you were saying about the economy, David, the economy is such a big issue in the US election, but they're not actually looking at why do things cost more? And you look at the crop losses around the world. The cost of coffee's gone up. Olives have been hammered for the last couple of years, but wheat, rice, 35 degrees and above, rice fields start to fail. Well, we've seen 35 degrees and above for about 6 months in Asia, the rice growing region of the world. So it's going to get more expensive, right? So I think this is the time for us to build that community in those cities. And Johnny, one of the things I was going to ask you about is citizens assemblies. I know that, I don't know if you've been involved in any, but I think that's another, because the short-term democracy, 3 years, 5 years, getting the people involved in the longer term, so that it's not just about the politicians that come and go and keep changing and politicizing things that shouldn't be politicized. I mean, how do we get that long-term sort of focus? And I don't know, citizens assemblies seem to make sense to me. Paris is an example, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think civic participation is key to any key policy, whether it's implemented in the city or anywhere else. There are all sorts of ways of doing that. Some levels of government seem to be exempt from consulting with the community. Others do it very, very well. I think certainly in my city, local government is very quick to consult around any range of issues relating to new transport or upgrade of a park, or anything to do with young people, different sectors of the community, older people, different ethnic communities and so forth. Various strategies being developed at that sort of municipal level that where people can have access community forums, they can go to workshops, focus groups, all sorts of ways that we as civilians can have input into public policy. And the thing is, once you feel as though you have a stake in your community, then you're more likely then to get involved in what it is that you plan to do. And we know that collectively we can always achieve more together. So it's about breaking down that barrier between government and the citizen, and actually understanding that it's a partnership and working out ways of making that partnership work. Unfortunately, other levels of government seem to be exempt from those sorts of approaches. And I think that's partly why many people are quite cynical about governments generally in this day and age, because they don't feel as though they have a stake in what's going on.
I'd like to sort of take something that you described back and go on to that. I think, you mentioned about how people in their places, the trees on the north side of the road versus the tree on the south side of the road and so on, the people decide that. And I had an experience when I was visiting Nairobi a little while back, and there was this road called Nongon Road, which goes up into these hills along, and the top of that was this sort of town. It's quite well developed along there. And there was a tree, very ragged, I don't know what kind of tree, and there was a bench along there, and I sat down on it. It was late in the evening, and then this guy sat down and said, you're at our office. You're sitting at our office. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And we struck up this conversation. It turns out that he's a taxi driver. In the traditional sort of taxis, they have also the kind of the Ubers and things and so on. And he says, we actually fought to keep this tree, and they built a bench on it. And they were saying, you see along there, and he pointed out down the road all these billboards, and they says, they were empty billboards, but they said they cut down the trees to put up billboards because the trees blocked the view of the billboards. And they fought to keep this tree, and they said it provides shade. And actually what happens is people come and they talk to us, and because they talk to us, they actually book us, even though we're more expensive, to take them into the city center of Nairobi. And we wait for them and do those things which they can't do with the Ubers and stuff. But it's because we have this space here, which again goes down to what you're talking about. We can sit, and it's in the shade, and we're growing another tree over there, and he points further on, and surround in the middle of this kind of oil drum, cut a hole in the bottom. There's a small sapling growing, and they're using that to protect it. In the car park, they're growing another one in that way. And what you talked about in that sense made me think about local experts, basically.
Yeah.
And I want to think of it as local experts. And in a sense, the governance is not to mimic the democratic governance, but to have that local expert voice in that way. To allow each of us to be our local expert.
And to listen to them, right?
And to listen.
Yes. And it's a really important point, because I think any way that you can encourage ownership of public space by the citizenry, they're going to protect it, they're going to look after it, but you also create a space for social interaction more than anything. In the case of the taxi driver, there's also an economic as well as a social benefit. So all of these small things, which maybe start with a tree or a bench, in these very, very micro communities, if you like, they can really have some much broader benefits, as long as the people responsible for that space in terms of maintaining it are willing to listen to the view of the people who understand it, because that should ultimately guide how that space is used or improved going forward.
Yeah, nice.
But a nice example.
Sorry, I was just going to say, so I've just got to mute you, Johnny, because otherwise we boom through your speakers. But just wanted to say, it's getting dark, as you can see. We've just got a head now with John, and because it's Friday night for him, it's like Friday afternoon for me, Friday morning in Europe, obviously. Any final questions? There's so many. I wanted to talk to you about mental health and how that needs to become a priority within cities, managing the refugee crisis. I mean, maybe we can have you back on and we can just go through some real specifics. But I think, David and Richard, I don't know if you've ever spoken to someone like John before with his expertise, but it's fascinating and wide-reaching, right? When you listen, it's amazing. I mean, any final questions?
Just generally that, everything John has done and what he's involved with now is things that interest me greatly, that I know far less about than I should. And I'm very eager to learn more, because I can see the problems compounding on a virtually daily basis. And I don't see current politics being able to tackle it. It requires something else than, you know, a local or central politician saying, actually, we need to get a grip on this. And how ultimately in the world of politics you kind of tackle the short-sightedness and the viciousness of a political cycle where you don't actually have the time to start seeing the fruit from the things that you plant by taking right decisions. That interests me greatly, and you know, I'm on a daily basis, I have different ideas about this, but I certainly think our overall, and I'm broadly speaking, the Western world political process needs to improve, and we need to start actually having a debate about why some things that we nowadays more or less take for granted will not actually work, because the cycle is simply too short and there is no accountability.
Yeah. So you can go the totalitarian path, right? Or you can, right?
Absolutely. And I see.
Or we change the system. We keep
we
democracy.
Change the system. We need to have a proper debate about how you change a system which is clearly not working anymore.
Yeah.
Because the alternative is you go down a totalitarian path. And that has a lot of appeal.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking occasionally in those terms, you know. It's like, and then I need to pinch myself saying, yeah, I know where this leads to, and no good comes at the end of the road.
Or the benevolent dictator.
Yeah, of course, that's always the dream, right?
Well,
the almighty, benevolent.
I'm living in the city state that you know, that's basically how it started, and I see what's happening here, and you know, I see the preparedness for climate change and how seriously they've taken it for such a long time when the rest of the world wasn't even talking about it. You know, there's this reservoir to capture flooding. There was billions of dollars in investment under the city. It's never needed to be used, but it's there when it needs to be. They're doing experiments with white paint, and you know, everywhere you go, plants everywhere. Whereas before it might have been grass, it's trees, and they're flowering, so it's for the pollinators as well as normal trees. The EVs, you know, it was a slow start. Boom, they're everywhere. So I'm seeing in real time, you know, a country that's really focused, and it's that collective mindset that you see in Asia, where everyone comes together, and and it's like how they dealt with the pandemic. So it works here in this part of the world. I don't think it would work in the Western world. So what's the alternative that's not dystopian?
It's not going to work yet. I think we will come to the point, and what I would like to see is a debate about how we can facilitate that, because it will be needed. And effectively truncate the very, you know, totalitarian path, if we like that, and take away the appeal that those kind of arguments now seriously are getting a foothold in many places. Because, you know, as a history buff, I know where that particular path leads, and there's nothing good to come there at the end of that particular road.
It's the worst path from a climate perspective.
It is.
Right.
But I fully understand why it comes across as appealing to a large part of the electorate. I get that. Yeah. And the logical conclusion is you need to tackle the other side of the argument, but by actually having a proper debate and start reforming the systems, which are clearly not working.
Yeah. And the institutions
I think of it a little bit differently. I think of it as that, you know, it's this great tree which is our modern economy and our modern society, and it's like a giant sequoia that's been growing for, you know, a few thousand years, and it's had this growth spurt in the past few hundred years that's really kind of taken over, but it's gotten too heavy for itself, and it's collapsing basically, and it is going to collapse. I think a lot of these things ends up asking, well, how can we keep it up? But I think actually it is going to collapse. So the question actually is, how do you want to emerge out of that? What kind of things will help you emerge? And those are small, intangible things. And that's where the attraction of things like, you know, place in the city where you take your feet off, take your shoes off, whether that's inside the mall, as you say in Singapore, that you can actually do that, or whether it is in the square outside that actually finally got some tree cover and whatever it is that you can do it. And those are the things I think that are really important to what actually emerges rather than the political stories, because they ultimately is trying to keep up the same kind of control structure. We have a vote every 3 months, but what happens if we had that every 2 years or more frequently, and all those things? Because it is
some funny going off your sound, David. Are we back? All right. So just to wrap up and let Johnny go and Johnny's family.
It's Friday night in Sydney.
Yeah, and I know what that means.
That's right. Time to paint the town red.
Oh yeah. Oh, we're used to. John, so for you, just any final last words? We have a sort of an underlying message of acceptance. We understand what's happening and the implications, and we're trying to always get that message out. And I think what David was just saying was very much aligned to that sort of idea. But any sort of final words?
I agree with David and Richard. I think, certainly in terms of what David said, that the tree is definitely under pressure, and the system, as Richard said, needs a big overhaul. There's no doubt about that. How we do that is the question, and I think, fundamentally that will come down to sort of negotiating our way through resolving the tensions between personal desire and the public interest. Yeah. And I think if we can resolve that tension, then we're well on the way to achieving a better world.
Yeah, I like that. We just need to start talking about it, right, and addressing it, because here we are, and it's real, and it's not working, and yeah. So maybe when you get your book published, we'll all get a copy and we'll have a good read, and then we'll bring you back, and then we'll go into some of the other areas, because we can go for hours.
You have a title for it yet?
Tentatively just called Safe, Just and Livable Cities.
Okay.
And then the catch cry underneath it will be planning and designing for crime prevention.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we'll see what the publisher says.
Oh, good luck.
I've still got to put my neck on the block, so I'm not sure what that process involves exactly.
Yeah.
I might have to come to you people for advice on that.
Yeah, there's a lot of nonsense out there. I spent a lot of money on things that really, don't. The Instagram book influencers are definitely something I would not recommend. They do something like wave your book around for 2 seconds, and then the next video you see they're giving the books away for free. You're like, oh, yeah, great. So it's not really, it's hard. But your audience is going to be very specific as well. But I think it's very interesting for a wider audience if people have got the patience to really sit down and go through it, because it's fascinating, right? For all of us. Yeah. All right. So thank you, John. Really appreciate it. Great to see David and Richard.
Thanks, David. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you so much, Andrea.
And we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Part 2.
Yeah, we do. And we're gonna, in a couple of weeks, the title is The Air We Breathe, and we're going to bring an expert on air pollution. And we're going to look at that because it's obviously a massively important issue in the world. Yeah. I was just saying that, if 100 people die in a fire, 500 people actually die in the fire later because of the damage. It's a massive. So air pollution is an important topic. All right. So we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Okay. Cheers.
See you all. Bye.
Bye.